These are 6 fine print lease clauses commercial tenants often overlook. I'm Dale Willerton, the lease coach, author of Negotiating Commercial Leases and Renewals for Dummies. You can get a complimentary copy on our website at theleasecoach.com. Over the 30 plus years that I've been negotiating leases and lease renewals for tenants, I have probably read 2,500 lease agreements. And often what happens is a tenant will discover us. There'll be an existing business, they'll have an existing lease agreement. Their lease will come up for renewal and they'll discover the lease coach. So they'll reach out to us for some help. Very common. The very first thing I do is I start by reviewing their current lease document to see what they negotiated, what they put in, what they left out. And that's very interesting reading, because when I'm negotiating a lease renewal, I'm not just focusing on the rental rate. We may have to renegotiate 8 or 10 clauses inside the lease agreement to correct what the tenant overlooked in the beginning. Every commercial lease agreement has fine print details. Now, these are not necessarily legal loopholes or that type of thing. In other words, your attorney may not even point some of these clauses out to you because they're not illegal, and in fact, they're quite common. But as a business owner, you need to be savvy enough to see them and negotiate them or have them removed. Fine print clause number 1, the security interest clause. In your lease agreement, it's probably called security interest. It could come under a couple of different names, but don't be thrown off. The security interest agreement is in pretty much every lease agreement. Now, what this means is when you build out your space as a tenant, you put in your equipment, your chattels, your FF&E, the landlord gets first security interest according to the lease agreement over that. So it's like collateral. If you don't pay your rent, he's got something to grab onto. So let me use an example of a residential mortgage. You know that if you're about to get a residential mortgage, you want to buy a house, you're going to go to a bank and you're going to get pre-approved, right? And the bank's going to give you a first mortgage on that property. When you buy that property, you own the house, but the landlord has collateral. They can take the house away if you don't make the payments. In a commercial lease agreement, it's not a mortgage, it's called a security interest agreement. So that must be negotiated so that the landlord takes second position. Here's what I mean. The average startup business owner goes to a bank and he borrows money for a business loan, maybe an SBA loan, and he gets pre-approved. Then he goes out, finds a location, negotiates a lease, signs the lease agreement, and then the banker drops something on you you weren't expecting. He says, have your landlord sign this document. It's usually 2 pages, and it basically says the landlord gives up first security interest so the bank can have first security interest, right? Two can't be on there. On a residential house, you can have a first mortgage, a second mortgage, a third mortgage, even a fourth mortgage, right? Same thing with security interest. Landlord needs to take position 2 so the bank can take position number 1. And if you have completely negotiated your lease agreement, signed it, and then you go to the landlord with the letter from the bank, the landlord's going to say, no, we didn't agree to sign that. We're not going to sign it. Now you can't get your financing. Now you have a problem because you've already signed the lease agreement. I see this happen all the time with tenants. I remember one tenant in San Diego, a catering company. They actually were aware of this. I told them about it. I showed them exactly in their clause. I was just coaching them. So I said, you're going to have to go and talk to your banker about this and see if he needs that security interest letter. The banker said no. So she went ahead, signed her lease agreement, did everything. But then when she went back to actually get the loan money to start the business, they said, oh yeah, we overlooked that. We do need this signed by your landlord. Problem, landlord wouldn't sign it. So when you communicate with your banker about borrowing these funds, make sure you get an email. Will my landlord need to sign any paperwork, give anything up, that type of thing? Have it in writing, not just casual, a word of mouth. So when it comes to the security interest agreement, you can ideally negotiate to remove it. That's what we try to do with the lease coach. We'd actually like that clause to be totally removed. And so if you're starting a new lease, it's probably going to be in there. But if you're doing a lease renewal and your bank loan is paid off and you're doing a pretty standard renewal, we'll negotiate for the security interest to be released, okay? If it's in there now, we're going to try to remove it on the lease renewal negotiations. And this is important from a buyer's perspective. If you go to sell your business, they may flag that as a problem because now the buyer's trying to get financing and his bank wants first security interest. Your bank has to give that up and the landlord has to consent. It can get a little bit messy. So be aware of this clause, first security interest. Fine print clause number 2, the insurance clause. Every lease agreement has a requirement for the tenant to buy a certain amount of insurance. And tenants understand this and tenants want insurance. The problem often comes down to how much insurance does the landlord want you to buy. It's very expensive. I remember one client in Brooklyn starting up a new business, food service business, and I said to her, look, I want you to get a quote. You know, we've got the formal lease agreement. I'm going to be reviewing it over the next couple of days. Take the page, the insurance clause page out of your lease agreement, send it to your insurance broker and get a quote. And she said, well, you know, I wasn't going to do that right now. I said, no, I think you should because we need to know if these amounts they're asking you, the 2 million, 5 million coverage, are all reasonable, right? Because you're going to have 2 insurances. You're going to have liability in case someone gets hurt in your store or business, and you're going to have like fire and theft, damage, that type of thing. So she goes to her insurance broker, and he comes back and says $12,000. Now this is like a 1,200 square foot store, not very large. And her insurance quote was $12,000 because of the landlord's requirements for overkill on the insurance. We all agreed we need insurance, but that much, 5 million, could we negotiate it down to 2 million? That type of thing. It was going to be cost prohibitive. So you have the opportunity to get your insurance quote in advance, know what your cost is going to be, and if the cost is too high, go back and negotiate it with the landlord before you sign the lease agreement agreeing to it. One of the highest individual costs in an insurance clause is business interruption insurance. Usually the landlord will want you to have up to 12 months of insurance in case your business, you have a problem, you get hit by a bus, whatever the situation is, there's a fire, they want to be paid the rent from your insurance. That's normal. But I believe business interruption insurance should be optional to the tenant. Some of you are financially strong enough, you could pay the rent for 6 months even if you had no income, but whether you have insurance on it, that's going to be up to you. Almost every lease agreement, especially the more sophisticated ones, have in the insurance clause it says the landlord is co-insured or co-payee, meaning if your business, God forbid, catches on fire and you die in the fire, right? The landlord can cut the insurance from your insurance company to rebuild everything inside to the way it was. That's normal, but if you go to the landlord and you don't have that the landlord gets paid, you know, the tenant gets paid or the landlord gets paid the insurance, they're going to reject it and you're going to be not getting into the space. When I was a shopping mall manager, tenants would come into my office and they'd say, you know, the leasing agent set me up, we did that lease, I'm aware of all of this, I'm here to pick up my keys. And I say, terrific, did you bring a copy of your insurance? No, I thought I need my insurance before I open, right? Because I'm going to build my store out for 5 months. Then when I open, I need insurance, right? I said, no, you don't get access to the space until you provide us with insurance exactly as it's spelled out in the lease agreement. Now they could lose a week or 2 weeks over that before we'll give them the keys to the property. That's normal. Okay, that's not the problem. The problem is you've got to get on your insurance before, not after you sign your lease agreement. Fine print clause number 3, rent increases between terms. Now, buckle in. I'm going to explain this. You need to understand. A very common scenario is a tenant signs a 5-year lease agreement with a 5-year renewal option. And you have, when you're negotiating the current lease agreement, that is when you either negotiate what the rental rates will be on the option, or you can say the rental rates will be market but settled by arbitration. There's more than one scenario that can play out. But let's say in your first lease agreement it says 3% annual increases. And the landlord says, you know, I'd be happy with 3% annual increases on the renewal option 5-year term. You think, great. The piece of fine print you're missing is the landlord has a one-time right to increase the rents between those 5-year terms. Okay, you're missing that. You're thinking it's 3% all the way along. So a tenant will exercise their renewal option. Landlord comes back and says, yeah, you're right, it's locked in, 3% annual increases, but market rents have gone up in the past 5 years and we're increasing your rent 22%. So your rent will go up 22% off of year 5, and then it will do 3% annual increases. Tenants miss this all the time. And you don't want to exercise your renewal option and find out that that's about to happen to you. You need to find that out in advance. This is a very, very easy clause to miss in a lease agreement. It's literally one sentence buried somewhere in a paragraph this big, okay? But you don't want that surprise, your rent is going up 12% or 15% at the end of 5 years. Fine print clause number 4. Tenant allowance. I love negotiating tenant allowances for my clients. The tenant allowance, of course, is an amount of money the landlord is giving to the tenant as an incentive. I mean, the landlord doesn't really give you anything, right? We have to negotiate for it. But this money does not need to be repaid. And it can be anywhere from, $30,000 to $300,000. I did a large bar restaurant one time. The tenant allowance was $750,000. So the fine print in that clause that you're probably missing or not picking up on is this. You must spend it to claim it. So if you have a $150,000 tenant allowance and you only spend $125,000, they're only obligated to pay you $125,000. Okay? Now most tenants go over, so it's not an issue. And remember, your equipment does not count. You can't put your equipment into the tenant allowance. Okay? I used to work for a landlord. I was a shopping center manager, and this one property, I was not managing this shopping center. I was the leasing rep for the shopping center. And the landlord was notorious for agreeing to pay tenant allowances and then not paying them till they're on the courthouse steps. Because in the formal lease agreement, there was nothing putting a penalty on the landlord. No interest, no penalty. If they didn't pay you after 1 month, nothing happened to them. If they didn't pay you after 3 months, if they didn't pay you till the courthouse steps 9 months later when you're suing them, nothing happens to them. They just pay you out. Okay? Don't assume the landlord is going to pay the tenant allowance on time. Now, traditionally, the tenant allowance is paid 45 days after you open. Why 45 days? Because that's the period of time in which the painter or the contractor can put a lien on the building. If there's no lien on the building on day 46, it's too late legally for them to put a lien on. The landlord knows that's not going to happen, because if you don't pay your painter, or you think he did a bad job and you just, here, I'm giving you half, get lost, he'll go and put a lien on it, and now you've got a problem with the landlord. You'll actually be in default. So you don't want that to happen. The tenant allowance clause also requires you to prove that you spent it where you said you spent it, and to get all the improvements that you're about to do pre-approved. So the landlord typically in the lease it says the landlord you'll provide the landlord with drawings, CAD drawings or something like that, so they can approve what you're about to build. Then once you build it, you don't get the money up front, you get the money after. If it's a really, really large amount of money, sometimes we can get them to advance a third and then advance another third. But in most cases, like 90% of the time, you're not getting the tenant allowance up front. You've got to bridge finance it, you've got to use your own money and hope you get paid the tenant allowance later. So they can also get you on little things like the contractor didn't have enough insurance, or the contractor was not a pre-approved contractor to the landlord. If you don't get all the T's crossed and all the I's dotted with the landlord, they're going to resist paying you the tenant allowance, and now you're going to have a problem on your hands because you thought that money was coming in. Fine print clause number 5, leasehold improvement ownership. So, typical scenario. Tenant goes into a space, spends $80,000 or $280,000 building out the space and making it look beautiful. The formal lease agreement states that anything you glue, screw, or nail down inside the premises now belongs to the landlord. Ownership transfers to the landlord. On a day-to-day basis, that may not have a problem for you, but if you go to sell the business, right, and I do a lot of lease assignment work, and I might be hired by the buyer of the business or the seller of the business. One of them is hiring me to help them through the lease assignment or the lease transfer process. And they will come to me and say, well, why do I have to pay for $150,000? He, on his list of assets, what he's charging me, he's $100,000 for the equipment, $200,000 for the leasehold improvements. Why do I have to pay that if those leasehold improvements now belong to the landlord? I'm talking about the carpet or the floor covering, the ceiling, the lighting, all those things. So it could hold you up or cause you a problem when you're selling your business, because the buyer might be savvy enough to see, well, you're trying to sell me carpet that you no longer own, right? You're trying to sell me cabinets on the wall that you no longer own. So ownership of those leasehold improvements should be pre-negotiated in most scenarios. Fine print clause number 6, the demolition clause at the end of your term. So the lease agreement anticipates or expects you to eventually move out. You might be thinking, well, I'm never going to move out. I'm going to sell my business and it'll keep going. But a lot of tenants don't make it, right? They fail, or they might even complete their entire lease agreement, but then they're going to move out. You maybe just spent $300,000 building out a business inside. The typical lease agreement says the landlord has the choice. The landlord can say, leave those improvements behind, sort of in broom swept condition, or remove those improvements. And why would they say remove those improvements? Let's say I just finished speaking at a Coffee Fest convention in Chicago, and I have well over 100 coffee shop clients. If you're about to open up a coffee shop, for example, and you go to that location because it was a previous coffee shop that failed. So you're getting second generation coffee shop space. And after running that business for 3 or 4 or 5 years, you're not making a profit and you move out. The landlord's probably going to say, maybe a coffee shop doesn't belong there. So I don't want you to leave in the plumbing and the electrical and even the bathrooms where you put them. I want that 100% taken out. And because we're going to put in a dentist or a chiropractor, the landlord's thinking coffee shops aren't working. This is the second one in that location. So you could incur another $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 of demolition costs. Remember, if you take cabinets off the wall, you're responsible for repairing that wall, sometimes even taping it and sanding it and painting it. The degree of how much you restore the property is negotiable in the lease agreement, but tenants just don't think about that. They're thinking about getting their business built and open. They're not thinking about the day they close. So remember, a commercial lease agreement has well over 1,000 clauses. It can be tricky. Turning to an attorney may not give you the information you want because, as I said, these clauses are not illegal. What we do at the Lease Coach for tenants is we do a 39-point lease inspection. So I've got 2 daughters, and I've bought them both a used car. When I negotiated to purchase the used car on the used car lot, once I negotiated the price, I took the car to a mechanic, one of my clients. He inspected it and told me what was wrong with it, when would we have to replace the brakes and things like that. He could top up the fluids and whatnot. It didn't mean I necessarily did not buy the car because there was problems with it, but I knew what the problems were, all right? So when you take a car to a mechanic, you've maybe seen these. They're electronic now, but more so in the old days, you'd get a piece of paper with check boxes. Check the hoses, check the radiator, check the tires, check the brakes. All those things are checked off. And you'll see a couple of them that are X's. That's what he's going to show you. Oh, you notice you got a crack in the windshield. Oh, you've got no spare tire. You've got only 10% tread left on these tires. You want to know that. We do that, a 39-point lease inspection on a commercial lease agreement. And this will bring out some of these fine print clauses so that you can be aware of them and decide whether you want to negotiate these with the landlord or you want the lease coach to do so. My number one recommendation is that you go to theleasecoach.com, order a complimentary copy of my book, Negotiating Commercial Leases and Renewals for Dummies. It's not my first book, it's actually my 3rd book. I've been doing this for 30 years for tenants, and even before that, of course, working for landlords. This book is going to give you a lot of incredible information and content. It's written for tenants. And I used to be a tenant. I've owned several businesses in the past where I had commercial leases. So it's a really solid read for anyone negotiating a new lease or even negotiating a lease renewal. So subscribe and follow the Lease Coach. It'll be worth your while.